As China faces swarms of locusts, local officials are saying this will be the new norm. The United States is allegedly planning to order China to reduce its number of diplomats in the United States. And the CCP's war propaganda is starting to lose its effectiveness among the Chinese people. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, the local government has disqualified 12 pro-democracy candidates, including Joshua Wong, from running in the upcoming election for the Legislative Council. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Locusts coming into China from abroad may become a new norm, according to a July 27 statement from the CCP's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. Now, the ministry only emphasized that locusts invaded China from abroad, but did not explain that the locust plague is already ravaging many parts of China. It's claiming the issue is, quote, preventable and controllable. The yellow spine locust moved from Laos to the border of Yunnan, China. As of July 26th, the yellow spine locust had been in 3 states and 6 counties and covered an area of around 23,000 acres. Now, when the ministry held a meeting on July 27th, it stated the locusts, quote, came early with many peaks and large amounts of insects. It also stated that the, quote, frequency of migration of the yellow spine bamboo locust from abroad has increased in the past 5 years, and it may become a norm/usual in the future. Now, the CCP emphasized from abroad with each mention of the locusts, and the ministry only emphasized that the locusts are invading China from outside. The Epoch Times compiled local media reports to show that the locusts have already spread heavily through mainland China. Some netizens are also commenting that the locust plague has already spread and it's too advanced for the Chinese Communist Party's officials to admit. Meanwhile, local farmers in China are saying government subsidies have been of little help. In addition to the floods, the locusts, and existing food shortages during the pandemic lockdowns, China's food supplies have suffered disasters. Now, Chinese media recently exposed multiple fires in grain storage facilities in multiple regions of China. The CCP office in charge of grain reserves in Heiliangjiang recently revealed that there are quality problems in the one-time grain storage facilities, and a large amount of, quote, sieve is hidden under the moldy grain. A farmer in Hunan, a Mr. Chen, spoke with the Epoch Times in an interview. He believes that by the end of this year, grain supplies in China will be very tight. He said this, quote, there has been fires in many granaries recently. Mold and worms are also found in the granaries. There is also grain storage fraud. Therefore, I am greatly concerned about food security this year. As for the large-scale locust plagues, Mr. Chen said this year is very extraordinary. He said, quote, locusts migrate frequently and they're very likely to invade China. It's hard to say what will happen. The locusts have caused food prices to increase all over the world and will also affect China. And he added, quote, nowadays, the abandonment of cultivated land is very serious, and no one grows food, which will also cause food shortage. Mr. Li, a farmer in Poyang County in Jiangxi Province, also told the Epoch Times that Chinese agriculture is very dangerous. Money can't be made from farming, and so the issue of farmers abandoning cultivated land is becoming very serious. He said, quote, people in their 50s are the youngest farmers. Those under the age of 40 are not real. They are only registered as farmers. Now, the CCP issued another central document this year emphasizing that grain production should be stable in terms of policies, areas, and yields. It holds that local officials in provinces, cities, and counties are accountable for food security. Increased rewards are given for major grain-producing counties, and it also gives subsidies to rice, corn, and soybean producers. However, Mr. Chen said that while the government has increased some subsidies, the actual subsidies are little and are barely enough to incentivize farmers to work. He said, quote, the average family has only 2 to 3 mu of land, which is about 1/3 to half an acre total. And the cost of planting rice seedlings and harvesting pesticides and fertilizers, so on, is several thousand yuan. Calculate it. You can only make 300 to 500 yuan per mu. The government gives a subsidy of 100 yuan per mu and does not help much. Now, 300 yuan would be around $42, and 500 yuan would be about $71. Meanwhile, when it comes to the CCP virus, The situation appears to be growing worse in Xinjiang, where there are now 2 cities on lockdown and where the virus appears to be spreading elsewhere. Overnight, local authorities announced close to 100 new confirmed cases and say they're still not able to find the source of the outbreak. Of course, the CCP has a record of suppressing data on the number of cases, so the numbers are never quite reliable. And also, local officials are incentivized to suppress data on cases as well. Now, with that said, authorities in Xinjiang issued a warning stating they will search for people who, quote, spread false rumors of the epidemic. Among the so-called rumors that were spread on July 25th, for example, were allegations that several cities in the western regions of Xinjiang would be placed on lockdown. This included Karamai and Yili. The local government immediately issued a warning threatening to investigate, quote, criminal behavior of spreading false rumors about the closure of the city and disturbing the people. However, only a few hours after the warning, the government locked down Karamai in Yili at 4 a.m. local time on July 27th. Meanwhile, while these strange seed packets from China are being sent unsolicited to people in the United States, the UK, and Canada, Taiwanese officials are claiming that some of the seed packets that came through Taiwan did not originate in Taiwan. A packet of seeds that was sent to Canada was found to have been shipped through Taiwan, and Taiwanese postal officials say the seeds had also been shipped through Taiwan from elsewhere. As Focus Taiwan reported that on July 30th, the Changhua Post Office in Taiwan confirmed that it shipped the package for a private logistics company that had brought the packet into Taiwan from a client. And in other news, the Washington Times published an exclusive report alleging the Trump administration is preparing to order China to reduce its diplomats in the United States to levels equal to the number of U.S. diplomats allowed in China. Now, the report cited unnamed senior State Department officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity. Part of the move is allegedly to reduce the burden on FBI counterintelligence agents who have close to 2,000 agents focused on arresting Chinese spies and agents. This also comes after the United States ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston and after the CCP retaliated by closing the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, China. Now, the report quotes an unnamed senior U.S. official stating, quote, "By August, we want reciprocal levels and access." And now for the broader stories for today. When the U.S. consulate in Chengdu was ordered to close by the CCP, it posted a note on Twitter stating, quote, "Today we bid farewell to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. We will always miss you." As Epoch Times reported, Chinese internet users responded by supporting the U.S. consulate. Among these comments was, quote, "When China gets rid of the CCP's totalitarian rule and returns to a civilized country, you are welcome to come back. May this day come soon." Another wrote, quote, "You will come back when the communist bandits are destroyed." Now, this was shown in sharp contrast to reactions among American citizens when the CCP's consulate in Houston was closed. After Chinese consul Kai Wei published his open letter, Americans didn't appear to send their best or express hopes that the CCP would soon return. Now, this shows something important. The main concern of the Chinese people when the consulate was closed in Chengdu was that the Americans were leaving and the idea of the United States was leaving with them. They talked about how when the Chinese communist bandits are gone, that the U.S. could come back. And they were saying that they hoped the U.S. could come back soon. When the Chinese consulate closed in the U.S., that was not the reaction. The reaction was largely, well, it's a totalitarian regime and, possibly they're doing different forms of espionage out of it. Most people by this point accept and understand that the Chinese Communist Party does a lot of spying on Americans and that it uses different operations to steal intellectual property. If there was any pushback by Americans, it was out of concern of a diplomatic breakdown between the U.S. and China. But this highlights something important, the different ideas of how these countries are viewed. Americans typically don't view the Chinese Communist Party as a system that brings freedom, whereas the Chinese people, at least based on their comments, viewed the U.S. as a symbol of freedom, and they viewed the removal of the U.S. consulate from Chengdu as a loss of that freedom. Now, in other news, Sino Insider had a great piece of analysis that I wanted to delve into a bit more. Now, it noted an important point, that when it comes to U.S. sanctions against CCP leaders and businesses, which we're seeing a lot more of now, and even when the CCP tries to strike back at the United States in tit-for-tat retaliations, the CCP, and especially its leadership, has a lot more to lose than the United States does. Now, this comes down to a fundamental and easily overlooked point. CCP officials tend to send their children abroad to study and send their relatives and assets abroad. If they're hit by sanctions, these sanctions hit deep. And taken into the broader context of what's at risk for them, and with the US even proposing a travel ban on all 90 million Communist Party members in China, this is causing quite a stir. Now, the important point here is what it means within the CCP's own political system and with infighting among CCP officials. All of this puts additional pressure on CCP leader Xi Jinping, and it has a direct impact on the stability of the party itself. Now, Sino Insider reports this, quote, "The more officials are sanctioned, the more Xi will find himself under pressure from factional rivals in the regime elite, many of whom already hold him responsible for the CCP's foreign policy fiascos." So on this note, what are the signs of internal instability within the Chinese Communist Party? And also, would other CCP officials dare to stand up against Xi? Now, when a lot of people interpret China, when a lot of people try to interpret the CCP, they see Xi Jinping as kind of the supreme leader, right? He's the individual who controls all of China. He's the head of the Chinese Communist Party. And also he got rid of term limits, meaning that he's in for good, essentially. Now, what does this really mean? What is the real situation in China? The real situation in China is that you have different factions within the CCP itself, many of which are against Xi. And also you have different breakings happening within the CCP itself. Not just among the top-level officials, but even among provincial-level officials. We saw again, for example, during the virus outbreaks, that local officials were disobeying higher commands. China is risking a system of, say, balkanization, where it does risk splitting into different countries based on this alone. And also when there's pressure against these individual politicians, these individual CCP officials, they turn their eyes to Xi Jinping and they view him as being responsible for what is taking place. They see him as the pilot of this large ship, and they see him having, say, established new forms of control over the CCP, where now he does control a lot of different parts of the country, although not all of them. We'll get into that a bit later. They see him, basically steering this ship, and if they see him steering it the wrong way, they hold him personally responsible for it, which means that Xi is facing internal instability within the party. And as pressure mounts against individual CCP leaders, that pressure on Xi also mounts. Now, faced with this situation, what can Xi do? Well, you could say that he could, give some ground and fold to some of the US pressure. Say, reform some of the hostile actions of the CCP. But if you understand the real situation in China, that may not be an option. Conceding ground to the US would be seen as a weakness in some regards. Now, they might say, for example, sign an agreement, and as soon as the ink dries, or before it even dries, begin violating it. Because they understand that if they sign an agreement with the US, the process of the US, finding that violations took place and launching investigations and coming out with reports and then responding to it will likely take years. As far as they're concerned, that's post-Trump. That's part of another era when it comes to foreign policy. So what do? Well, when it comes to Xi, what he's doing right now is he's walking back on Deng Xiaoping's policy of this soft power form of diplomacy. Again, Deng Xiaoping, a few leaders back, he was the one who did the reforms in opening up to the West. Deng Xiaoping believed in using this friendly veneer when it came to interacting with other countries. Xi Jinping has thrown that out. Xi Jinping is using wolf warrior diplomacy. And it's a cheap name pulled from a Chinese action film. But basically what it entails is this. Again, the CCP meets like with like. If you criticize the CCP, they will criticize you back on the same grounds. If you sanction the CCP, they will sanction you back on the same grounds, so on and so on. They meet like with like. They respond to everything with hostility. And this is causing the CCP to actually lose a lot of friends internationally. And when it comes to this meeting like with like policy, well, again, the Chinese Communist Party has a whole lot more to lose when it comes to things like sanctions and other initiatives. And on this note, too, expanding on it, the systems of power in China are more complicated than they appear at the surface. Again, while Xi Jinping is the head of the CCP and got rid of term limits and is widely seen as being the supreme leader of China again, this isn't really the case. There are factional battles, and different factions control different assets and parts of the country. Now, Xi's faction has been fighting with the others, the main one being that of Jiang Zemin, who was the CCP leader 2 leaders ago. At the same time, Xi has been consolidating power, and his faction now does control quite a bit of China. Generally, it controls the Military Public Security Bureau and the paramilitary People's Armed Police. Some analysts are now pointing out that it appears Xi is looking to take back the financial structures in China, and by ending Hong Kong's autonomy, demonstrated that establishing control over these systems is more important to him and to the CCP leadership than even to the CCP's economy and foreign diplomacy. Now, as an example of this, we can look to diversified investment company Tomorrow Holding, which is involved in banking, insurance, real estate development, coal, cement, and rare earth minerals. Chinoscope noted that in 2015, this company was accused of being part of China's stock market crash, which was regarded at that time as an attempted financial coup against Xi, again taken in context of these internal, say, factional battles. Now, the head of that company was Xiao Jianhua, who was arrested in 2017 in Hong Kong and was sent back to mainland China. His whereabouts are still unknown. And recently, on July 17th, as Chinoscope notes, the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission announced it would take over 4 insurance companies and 2 trusts from Tomorrow Holding. Now, this meant, in addition to other actions taken against the company, that authorities seized roughly $171 billion in assets. Now, Tomorrow Holding responded a day later by publishing a, quote, solemn statement on Chinese social media site WeChat. It said the company had cooperated with CCP authorities, said authorities, quote, spared no effort to push for the takeover, and questioned the agenda behind the move. The statement was pulled down just hours later. Now, we should note in passing that that company does have very close ties to the Jiang faction, and again, this is seen as part of the factional battles within China. But it ties to some deeper things as well. First off, of course, that the CCP can take over companies whenever it wants. It is not a normal capitalist society. It is state capitalism, meaning socialism, essentially, or socialism with Chinese characteristics as the CCP would describe it. It's state capitalism. The state controls the capitalist systems. Chinoscope cites Elmer Yuen also, who is a Hong Kong businessman and activist who we've had previously on this show, explaining some of the deeper context of what we're currently seeing. He said this ties closely to infighting among CCP leaders. And a summary of his statement says this, quote, the retired former top leaders are pressing Xi Jinping. Xi is pushing Jiang Zemin and his faction to bring back the money that they pocketed earlier. Now that Xi has control over the military, public security, and the armed police, his next battle is the financial power. Now, of course, whether Xi could achieve that, and also the stability of China's financial system, are still questionable. But this does point to the infighting taking place behind the scenes. And at the same time, this should be viewed in context of what we just went over a bit ago. Factor in the US sanctions against Chinese businesses and against CCP officials, and also the additional pressure that is placing on Xi's faction when it comes to political infighting. Now, meanwhile, CCP propaganda attempting to rile up sentiments about the United States and also preparations for war don't appear to be taking hold among many Chinese people. Now, RFA is reporting that while the CCP is holding nuclear defense drills, is launching anti-American propaganda, and is using other measures like this, the Chinese people no longer appear to be buying it. Instead, it notes, the propaganda and drills meant to incite hatred against the United States are having the opposite effect, from being seen as standard practice of the CCP on the lighter end to being a sign of incompetence by the CCP on the more critical end. So what are we seeing here? Now, are the Chinese people familiar with the CCP's propaganda tactics? This is an important question to ask. We can look to China's netizens. Now, they have all kinds of ways of getting around CCP censorship. When the CCP wants to say censor terms that would criticize CCP leader Xi Jinping, they have to censor over 35,000 different phrases because the Chinese people are so aware of the different forms of censorship that they've developed all kinds of nuances and ways of referring to CCP corruption and to Xi Jinping, to the extent that CCP censorship bodies need to have, just over 35,000 terms just to censor discussions on Xi. And so on that note, I would say the answer is yes. Chinese people are absolutely aware of the different propaganda tactics the CCP uses, which means that if they can understand the mechanisms behind it, these propaganda tactics are not nearly as effective as the CCP would like them to be. And also another question, would the CCP resort to war? And why are they holding nuclear drills? A couple points on this. When it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, at least in my analysis, they would not go to open warfare unless they absolutely had to. If you want to talk about their forms for open warfare, well, that would be more surprise attack or things they have further down the line. They would need to develop their military much further now. Different analysts, for example, even question whether the CCP could even win a war against Taiwan, let alone a war, for example, that would likely bring in Japan, Australia, the United States, many parts of Europe, and many other countries as well. And a question, too, is why are they holding these nuclear drills? Well, for the Chinese people, this is partly fear. If a war were to take place in China, China has all kinds of nuclear power plants, and any kind of bombings, any kind of direct war, would also include nuclear fallout, at least based on their propaganda and analysis. And so here's another question. If that is taking place, if very likely the CCP would not have open warfare, if they're holding these nuclear drills more so for just, say, internal propaganda, are the Chinese people aware of this? It does appear so. And based on this analysis, based on statements that RFA even had from locals in China, it does appear the Chinese people are becoming numb to the different propaganda tactics the CCP is using and to the different, say, party phrases it is using and different methods it's taking to try to rile them up in hatred against foreign enemies. Instead, they're turning that against the CCP. They're criticizing the CCP, and they're seeing the CCP as being incompetent. Now, in other news, the CCP appears to be taking several steps to ensure its hold on key resources around the world. Reuters reports that China is planning stricter rules for steel capacity swaps, which were stopped at the beginning of the year, and will also expand to key areas in which they are used. When it comes to iron, reports in Australia have noted that while the country is taking a stronger stance against the CCP, diplomatically and against its claims in the South China Sea, authorities in China have been hitting back against the Australian economy, and also diplomatically. Yet one industry hasn't been hit, which is iron. This is being taken as a sign that the CCP needs Australia's iron, and that this need surpasses even its diplomatic interests. Now, with that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to that in the description below. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, it really helps this channel grow. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.